The thermometer outside read 50 below zero, but inside Desmond Byrne's half-buried cabin, the fire burned low and lazy while he sat in his shirt sleeves, mending a boot. Other prospectors 3 miles down the gulch were burning through their entire winter woodpiles in a single, desperate week. But Desmond's strange dugout home, the one they'd mocked all summer as the Irishman's grave, stayed warm with a fraction of the fuel. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you're drawn to stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity, hit subscribe because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The blizzard hit on February 9th, 1876, 3 hours after sunset. Desmond Byrne and Cormac O'Sullivan had seen storms before during their 2 winters, working the placer claim in Alder Gulch. But this one came with a cold that felt different. The wind didn't howl so much as cut, slicing through the Montana darkness with a sound like tearing canvas. Inside their log cabin, Cormac fed another split of pine into the barrel stove. The metal glowed dull red along the seams. The heat radiating from its surface made the air shimmer. Yet 10 feet away near the door, frost was forming on the interior wall. Desmond watched his partner work, noting the methodical way Cormac stacked the wood. They had built the cabin the previous spring using the same techniques every prospector in the territory used. Logs notched at the corners, mud and moss chinked between the gaps, a single leather-hinged door, 1 small window covered with oiled paper. The structure measured 12 feet by 14 feet with a dirt floor and a pole roof covered in sod. It had kept them alive through 1 winter already. It should have been adequate. By midnight, the temperature outside had dropped to 30 below. Cormac kept feeding the stove. Desmond lay on his bunk wrapped in 2 wool blankets and a bearskin, watching his breath cloud in the air despite the fire roaring 6 feet away. Something was fundamentally wrong. The cabin couldn't hold the heat. Every BTU the stove generated seemed to vanish into the walls, through the roof, out around the doorframe. The wind found every gap in the chinking, every imperfect joint, every weakness in their construction. Cold air poured in at ground level while warm air escaped through the ceiling. Cormac fed the fire every 20 minutes through the night. By dawn, they had burned through a week's worth of their woodpile. The Irishman's hands were raw from handling frozen wood. His face was gray with exhaustion. When Desmond finally convinced him to sleep, Cormac collapsed on his bunk, still wearing his coat and boots. Desmond took over fire duty, maintaining the same desperate pace. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared on February 12th, the sky turned crystalline blue and the temperature dropped even further, 42 below zero, according to the mercury thermometer. Desmond checked at dawn. Inside the cabin, despite a fire that had burned continuously for 70 hours, the temperature barely reached freezing. Water in their cooking pot had a skim of ice. Cormac's boots, which he had finally removed the night before, were frozen solid. That morning, Desmond noticed his partner couldn't feel his feet. The flesh was waxy white, the toes dark at the tips. Frostbite, severe and deep. Cormac tried to walk and collapsed. Over the next 3 days, the tissue died. Black lines of rot crept up from Cormac's toes toward his ankles. There was no doctor within 50 miles, no treatment that would help. Cormac O'Sullivan died on February 18, 1876, conscious and lucid until the final hour. He was 34 years old, strong as a draft horse, careful with fire safety, and experienced in wilderness survival. He died because a cabin built using accepted frontier methods couldn't protect him from cold. Desmond buried his partner on a hillside overlooking their claim, piling stones over the grave to keep animals out. He spent that night alone in the cabin that had killed his friend, unable to sleep, watching the fire burn and asking himself one question: why wasn't it enough? Desmond stayed at the claim after Cormac's burial. Other men might have abandoned the site, haunted by grief or superstition, but the gravel along the creek still showed color when he panned it. Gold remained in the ground, and leaving meant admitting his partner had died for nothing. So he stayed, working his sluice box alone and thinking constantly about the cabin. He began examining the structure with obsessive attention, the gaps between logs where chinking had cracked and fallen out during winter's freeze-thaw cycles, the door that fit loosely enough to let lamplight show around its edges at night, the single layer of logs, each maybe 10 inches thick, that comprised the only barrier between interior warmth and exterior cold. The roof, just poles and sod, through which heat rose and dissipated into the night sky. In March, as the worst cold finally broke, Desmond visited neighboring claims. He paid attention to other prospectors' cabins in ways he never had before. Every structure followed the same pattern: single-wall log construction, basic chinking, minimal attention to heat retention, and every prospector burned enormous quantities of wood just to maintain barely tolerable interior temperatures. Some men spent half their time cutting fuel instead of working their claims. An old French-Canadian trapper named Ledoux, camped 8 miles up the gulch, mentioned something that stuck with Desmond. They were talking about winter survival when Ledoux said, "The mine shafts, they stay warm. 40, 50 feet down, the earth never freezes. Even in January, you go down there, it feels almost comfortable." Desmond thought about that. 2 weeks later, he descended into his own prospect shaft, a 30-foot exploratory diggy he and Cormac had abandoned when the vein pinched out. At the bottom, standing in the narrow space with his lantern, he realized Ledoux was right. The temperature was maybe 45 degrees. Cold, certainly, but nothing like the 20 below that gripped the surface. The earth held warmth. Even in the depths of winter, the ground maintained a stable temperature. He climbed back to the surface and stood looking at his cabin. The structure sat fully above ground, exposed on all sides to wind and weather. Heat from the stove had to warm not just the interior air, but also fight against cold radiating inward from every frozen log. The cabin was trying to stay warm while completely surrounded by cold. It was an impossible task. That night, Desmond remembered his grandmother's cottage in County Cork. The old woman had lived in a stone structure built partially into a hillside. He recalled visiting as a child and noting how the cottage always felt moderate inside, neither hot in summer nor freezing in winter. At the time, he had assumed it was the thick stone walls. Now he wondered if it was something else. The earth itself, banked against 3 sides of the cottage, had acted as insulation. The ground's stable temperature had protected the interior from extremes. The idea that formed in Desmond's mind that March evening was simple and radical. Stop fighting the cold. Instead, use the earth itself as protection. Build a cabin not on the ground, but in it. Spring came late to Alder Gulch in 1876. Snow lingered in shaded hollows until mid-April, and the ground didn't thaw enough for serious digging until May. Desmond spent those weeks working his claim and planning. He sketched designs on scrap paper by lamplight, calculated dimensions, and made lists of materials. When the ground finally softened, he left the mountains. The journey to Helena took 4 days on horseback. He sold his winter's gold accumulation, modest but sufficient, to a buyer on Last Chance Gulch. Then he did something that other prospectors would have considered insane. Instead of spending his earnings on whiskey, women, and gambling like men who had survived a hard winter, he spent it on supplies: timbering tools, a surveyor's level, tar paper, 50 pounds of pine pitch, oakum for waterproofing, heavy canvas, iron hinges that cost more than a month's provisions. The merchant who sold him the supplies asked what he was building. Desmond said, "A cabin that works." The merchant nodded politely, clearly thinking the Irishman had lost his mind. Desmond returned to his claim on May 23rd. By May 25th, he was digging. He selected a spot 30 yards from his existing cabin on slightly elevated ground with good drainage. Using a shovel, pickaxe, and pry bar, he began excavating a rectangular pit. 12 feet by 16 feet, 5 feet deep. The work was brutal. The first 2 feet went easily, loose soil and small rocks. Below that, he hit clay mixed with stone. He dug from dawn until dark, removing earth one shovelful at a time, piling it nearby for later use. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back ached constantly. Fergus Brennan, who worked a claim half a mile downstream, came by on the third day. He stood at the edge of the pit watching Desmond work. "The hell are you doing, Des?" "Building a cabin," Desmond said, not stopping. "In a hole?" "Partly in a hole." Fergus spat tobacco juice. "That's a grave, not a building site." "It's a foundation." "Foundation for what? You planning to live underground like a badger?" Desmond climbed out of the pit, breathing hard. He explained his thinking. The earth stayed warm. A cabin built partially into the ground would be protected from wind and cold. The ground itself would act as insulation. Heat wouldn't escape as easily through walls surrounded by earth. Fergus listened, his expression skeptical. "Earth's cold, Des. That's why we build walls. To keep the ground away from us." "Earth 50 feet down never freezes," Desmond said. "I'm not going 50 feet, just 5. Enough to get below the frost line. Let the ground's warmth work for me instead of against me. And when spring melt comes, you'll be living in a pond. That's what the drainage is for." Desmond gestured to channels he had already dug, leading away from the pit at slight angles. Fergus shook his head. "You're wasting good mining weather digging a grave. But it's your summer." He left. Desmond went back to digging. By mid-June, the pit was complete. Word had spread among the nearby prospectors. They called it Byrne's Folly and the Irishman's grave. Desmond ignored them and began building. With the excavation complete, Desmond began selecting logs. He spent a week walking the surrounding forest, marking trees. He wanted straight spruce, approximately 12 inches in diameter, with minimal taper. Most prospectors used whatever timber was convenient. Desmond rejected any log that wasn't nearly perfect. He felled the trees, limbed them, and dragged them to his site using a borrowed mule. By early July, he had 40 logs cut to length and debarked. The pile represented twice the timber needed for a standard cabin. But Desmond wasn't building a standard cabin. He started with the foundation. In the bottom of his pit, he laid flat stones to create a level base, checking alignment constantly with his surveyor's level. Then he began stacking logs. The first course went down, each log notched at the corners using traditional saddle joints. He fitted them carefully, checking that each log seated firmly against the one below. The rectangular box took shape slowly. Desmond worked alone, using a rope and pulley system to lift logs into place. Each log was positioned, checked for level, then secured. Between each course, he packed oakum into the joints, creating a seal tighter than standard moss chinking. The work was meticulous and exhausting. The critical innovation came with the door frame. Standard cabins had doors at ground level. Desmond's door frame sat low, with the threshold 2.5 feet below the original ground surface. He built steps leading down into the earth, creating an entrance that required descent. The door itself would be half buried when the structure was complete. He understood the principle. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. By placing the entrance low, he created a natural cold trap. Air chilled to freezing would pool at the bottom of the steps, not flow into the cabin. Warm air inside would stay inside, unable to escape downward. The door construction took 3 full days. He used planks hewn from a single large pine, each board 3 inches thick. He fitted them edge to edge with such precision that daylight wouldn't penetrate the seams. Iron brackets, mounted diagonally across the interior face, reinforced the assembly. The hinges were massive, pinned through the door frame into the structural logs. To tear this door free, you would have to destroy the frame itself. By late July, the lower-level walls reached their full height, 4 feet above the pit floor. Desmond began the crucial waterproofing. He coated the exterior walls with pine pitch mixed with tallow, painting every log surface that would contact earth. The mixture was waterproof and would prevent rot. Then he packed clay mixed with gravel between the logs and the pit walls, creating drainage channels that would direct water away from the structure. Finally, he backfilled earth against the exterior walls, tamping it firm as he worked upward. When finished, the lower level appeared as a rectangular box emerging from the ground, with earth bermed to mid-wall height on all sides. The half-buried door sat in shadow, recessed below grade. It looked strange and vaguely unsettling. Desmond didn't care. The foundation was solid. August brought heat to the gulch, dry days perfect for construction. Desmond began building the upper level directly atop the buried rectangle. He laid the first course of logs across the top of the lower structure, creating the floor of the second story. These logs were notched to interlock with the walls below, distributing weight evenly across the foundation. The upper story walls went up using the same horizontal log construction he had used below. Each log was fitted with interlocking corners, the traditional saddle notch that had been used for generations. The difference was in Desmond's attention to detail. Every joint was tight, every gap minimized. He spent hours on individual logs, trimming and adjusting until they seated perfectly. The structure took on a distinctive form. The lower level remained a simple rectangle. The upper level rose in a traditional house shape with peaked roof lines. Where the walls ended and the gable began, Desmond switched techniques. The triangular gable sections used vertical logs instead of horizontal, standing planks fitted tightly together. It was easier to frame a peaked shape with vertical members, and the result was solid. The upper level served a specific purpose that most prospectors wouldn't understand. This wasn't just additional living space. It was a thermal buffer. Heat rises, always. In a standard cabin, that rising heat escaped through the roof and was lost. Desmond's design captured that heat in the upper story, creating a warm air pocket that insulated the ceiling of the lower level. The upper space would be used for storage, perhaps sleeping in moderate weather, but its primary function was thermal. The stone chimney began at the lower level, rising through both stories. Desmond built it carefully, selecting flat stones and mortaring them with clay mixed with sand and lime. The chimney was substantial, 18 inches square at the base, tapering slightly as it rose. Stone held heat. Long after a fire died to coals, the stone would continue radiating warmth into both levels of the cabin. The chimney placement was deliberate, not in the corner where many cabins had them, but closer to the center of the lower level. This allowed the stone mass to radiate in multiple directions, heating the space more efficiently. The roof construction consumed 2 weeks. Desmond built heavy ridge beams spanning the width of the cabin, then laid split planks across them. The planks overlapped like shingles, each layer covering the gaps in the layer below. Over the planks, he laid birch bark in multiple sheets, overlapping and sealed with pitch. Over the bark, he spread sod, living grass, and soil that would root and create a growing roof. The layered roof was heavy, but the robust wall structure supported it easily. More importantly, the roof was nearly impervious. Water would run off the sod. Heat would stay trapped beneath the bark and planks. Snow would pile deep without penetrating. By early September, the structure was complete. Desmond stood back and examined his work. 4 months of labor, a cabin unlike anything else in the territory. The neighboring prospectors called it Byrne's Fortress. Some called it the Fancy Grave House. Desmond called it home. Desmond moved into the cabin on October 3, 1876. He carried his belongings down the stepped entrance, through the half-buried door, and into the lower level. The interior was dark until he lit a lamp. Then the space glowed warm and close. Roughly 10 feet by 14 feet of living area. Stone floor. The chimney rising through the center. A sleeping platform he had built against one wall. Shelves for supplies. Simple, functional, and utterly unlike any prospector's cabin in Montana Territory. The first cold snap came in mid-October. Temperature dropped to 15 below overnight. Desmond built a fire in the morning using maybe 4 pieces of split pine. By noon, the fire had burned down to coals. He let it die. At sunset, when he returned from checking his sluice boxes, the cabin interior was still comfortably warm. He estimated 60 degrees without, adding more wood. He sat on his bunk that evening, not wearing a coat, and thought about the previous winter, the desperate, constant feeding of fire, the way Cormac had burned through wood like it was paper, the way the cabin had stayed cold despite their efforts. This was different. The earth surrounding the lower walls held warmth. The upper story trapped rising heat. The stone chimney radiated stored thermal energy hours after the fire died. November brought sustained cold, multiple days below zero. Desmond developed a routine. One fire in the morning, built up strong, let it burn for 3 to 4 hours, let it die to coals. The cabin stayed warm until the following morning. He used perhaps 1 armload of wood per day. His neighbors, he knew, were burning 5 times that amount. December arrived with the season's first major storm. The temperature dropped to 25 below and stayed there for a week. Snow accumulated on the roof, 2 feet deep, but the layered construction held firm. Inside, Desmond worked on equipment repairs, wearing a single wool shirt. Occasionally he added a piece of wood to keep coals alive, but no roaring fires, no desperate burning. The cabin held its heat with stubborn efficiency. He noticed condensation forming on the walls near the ceiling of the lower level. The space was so warm that moisture from his breathing and cooking was condensing on the cooler log surfaces. He adjusted his small ventilation ports in the upper story, allowing slightly more air circulation. The condensation decreased. No one visited. The other prospectors assumed Desmond was suffering in his strange, buried cabin, too proud to admit his design had failed. They expected him to emerge in spring, broken and embarrassed. Desmond didn't correct their assumptions. He simply continued his routine, comfortable in his half-buried fortress, burning a fraction of the fuel his neighbors required. By late December, he had empirical proof. His design worked. The cabin stayed warm without constant fire. The Earth's thermal mass, the reduced surface exposure, the heat stratification system, all the principles he had guessed at, were proving correct. Cormac had died in a cabin that fought the cold. Desmond lived in one that used the Earth itself as an ally. January 1877 brought cold that old-timers said they hadn't seen in 20 years. The temperature dropped through the first week of the month, falling past 30 below, then 40 below. On January 9th, Desmond's mercury thermometer read 45 below zero at dawn. The liquid metal was barely visible, contracted to a tiny thread at the bottom of the glass tube. The cold kept dropping. By January 11th, it reached 50 below and stayed there. The air itself seemed different at that temperature, thicker somehow, resistant to movement. Breath froze instantly into ice crystals that tinkled when they fell. Spit froze before hitting the ground. Metal burned exposed skin on contact. 3 miles down the gulch, Fergus Brennan was burning everything combustible. His stove glowed red day and night. He had gone through his woodpile and started on spare lumber, furniture, extra tools handles, anything that would burn. His cabin, built using standard methods, couldn't hold heat against 50 below air and wind. The temperature inside hovered just above freezing despite the roaring fire 3 feet away. On the 4th day, Fergus's stove cracked. Thermal stress from constant extreme heating fractured the cast iron barrel along a seam. The stove was still functional, but leaking smoke. Within hours, 2 other prospectors from nearby claims appeared at Fergus's cabin. Their situations were equally desperate. One man's chimney had caught fire from creosote buildup, forcing him to extinguish it and abandon the structure. Another had run completely out of firewood and was too weak from cold to cut more. Fergus made a decision. Byrne's place. We go there or we freeze. They rode through killing cold, 3 miles that felt like 30. The horses moved slowly, ice forming on their nostrils and eyelashes. The men wrapped blankets over their coats, scarves over their faces, but the cold penetrated everything. By the time they reached Desmond's claim, all three were shaking violently, fingers and toes numb. They found the strange half-buried cabin with its peaked upper story and approached the recessed entrance. Fergus knocked on the door, his knuckles barely able to form a fist. Footsteps inside, then the door opened. Desmond stood in the entrance wearing a wool shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. No coat. Behind him the interior glowed with lamplight. A small fire burned in the stone chimney, nothing dramatic, just moderate flames. "Jesus, Mary!" "And Joseph," Fergus whispered. They descended the steps into the cabin. The temperature difference was shocking. Outside 50 below. Inside warm enough that Desmond was comfortable in shirt sleeves. The three frozen men crowded near the fire, shaking. "How much wood you burning?" Fergus asked when he could finally speak. Desmond glanced at his small woodpile in the corner. "Maybe 3 armloads a day." Fergus looked around the cabin, at the earth-burned walls, the stone chimney radiating gentle heat, the comfortable dry air. "We've been doing it wrong," he said quietly. "All of us, all these years, we've been doing it completely wrong." They stayed 2 days while the temperature moderated, and they studied everything Desmond had built. Spring 1877 arrived late, snow lingering until April. When Fergus Brennan finally returned to his claim, he found his cabin barely habitable. The cracked stove was ruined. Frost damage had split several wall logs. The structure that had nearly killed him stood as testament to failed design. He rode back to Desmond's claim in early May. "I need help rebuilding," he said. "Will you show me how you did this?" Desmond agreed without hesitation. They spent 2 days walking Fergus's site, discussing placement, drainage, and dimensions. Desmond explained the principles. Excavate below the frost line. Waterproof everything that touches earth. Place the door low to create a cold trap. Build thick, build tight, build to trap heat rather than fight cold. "You don't need 2 stories like mine," Desmond said. "That was maybe excessive. But go deeper if you can. 6 feet instead of 5. More earth around the walls means more thermal mass." Fergus started digging in mid-May. Desmond helped for the first week, showing him how to create proper drainage channels, how to pitch the floor slightly for water management, how to select and prepare logs. After that, Fergus worked alone, but he followed Desmond's methods precisely. The cabin took 6 weeks to complete. Single-story, rectangular, buried 6 feet deep with only 2 feet of wall showing above grade. Heavy door, tight joints, stone chimney, layered roof. When finished, it looked like a grass-covered mound with a chimney, a door, and 2 small windows. Settlers passing through called it a dugout. Fergus called it salvation. Summer brought 2 more prospectors to Desmond's claim. Word had spread through the gulch about Fergus's new cabin and how Desmond had survived the 50 below cold in comfort. The men were respectful, almost embarrassed. "Heard Brennan's cabin uses half the wood," one said. "That true?" "Less than half," Desmond replied. "Maybe a third of what a standard cabin needs." He explained the concept again. Earth as insulation, thermal mass, reduced surface exposure. He didn't charge for the information, didn't claim ownership of the ideas. These were men trying to survive in a landscape that killed the unprepared. If sharing knowledge kept them alive, that was reason enough. By fall 1877, 4 half-buried cabins existed in Alder Gulch. By winter, those 4 structures proved themselves again. Their occupants burned minimal wood, stayed comfortable through cold snaps, and spent more time working their claims than cutting fuel. Word spread to other mining districts, Silver City, Bannock, Confederate Gulch. Prospectors talked and ideas traveled. Not everyone adopted the design. The extra work up front discouraged some. Others feared flooding or simply distrusted anything different from tradition. But those facing serious cold or limited timber supply began building what they called Byrne-style cabins, or simply dugouts. Desmond continued working his claim, largely unaware that his name was becoming attached to a construction method spreading across Montana territory. He had solved a problem that killed his friend. Other men had recognized the solution's value. That seemed sufficient. Between 1878 and 1882, variations of the half-buried cabin design appeared across the northern Rocky Mountains. Some builders went fully underground with sod roofs, creating structures that looked like grassy hills until you noticed the chimney and door. Others used Desmond's two-story approach, adding the upper buffer level. Still others compromised, building single-story cabins with only 3 feet of excavation, enough to gain thermal advantage without excessive labor. The key principles remained consistent across variations: excavation below frost line, waterproofing with pitch or tar, minimal surface exposure to wind, heavy doors placed low, stone chimneys for thermal mass, layered roofs to prevent heat escape. Men adapted the design to their specific situations, available materials, and skill levels, but the core concept persisted: use the earth as protection, not something to defend against. Desmond himself continued prospecting through 1882. His claim never produced a major strike, but consistent small yields gave him a modest living. He was known in the territory as competent, reliable, and unusually knowledgeable about winter survival. Occasionally, men stopped by his cabin asking about construction techniques. He always explained freely, walking them through drainage, waterproofing, and thermal principles. In 1883, at age 40, Desmond left the mountains. The placer deposits in Alder Gulch were largely worked out. The easy gold was gone. Younger men with more capital were moving in with hydraulic equipment. The era of lone prospectors working small claims with hand tools was ending. Desmond sold his claim for a modest sum and moved to Butte. The copper boom was transforming Butte from mining camp to industrial city. Desmond found work as a mining engineer, his years of underground experience valuable in mine design and timber planning. His understanding of earth stability, water management, and structural integrity translated well to hard rock mining operations. He worked steady hours for steady pay, a different life than the mountains, but not an unpleasant one. In 1885, he married Sarah Donovan, an Irish immigrant woman who worked as a seamstress. They had 3 children over the next 8 years. Desmond became a family man, a citizen of Butte, a member of the community. He attended church, paid his bills, raised his children with quiet competence. His frontier years became stories he told occasionally, not the defining feature of his identity. He never promoted his cabin design, never claimed credit, never sought recognition. When asked about his prospecting days, he talked about the work, the isolation, the satisfaction of finding gold. If pressed about the cabin, he explained the principles simply. Earth stays warm. Build into it. Use its stability. Most listeners nodded politely, and the conversation moved on. Meanwhile, in the mountains, the cabins remained. Some stayed occupied through the 1890s as new prospectors took over abandoned claims. Others sat empty but structurally sound, their earth-bermed walls and heavy roofs resisting decay far longer than longer. Conventional cabins. Homesteaders discovered them, recognized their superior design, and either moved in or copied the construction for their own use. Desmond Byrne died on March 14, 1904, at age 61 in Butte, Montana. Pneumonia took him quickly, 3 days from first symptoms to final breath. He was buried in Mount Moriah Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the city. His gravestone was simple granite, listing his name, birth and death years, and the phrase, "beloved husband and father." Nothing mentioned prospecting, cabin construction, or innovations that had saved lives across the territory. His children knew their father had worked mining claims before settling in Butte, but they never learned he had invented anything. To them, he was simply a patient man who had worked hard, provided for his family, and lived quietly. The half-buried cabin in Alder Gulch was unknown to them, a chapter of their father's life he had never emphasized. But in the mountains, evidence remained. Some of the original half-buried cabins were still occupied in the early 1900s by a new generation of prospectors and trappers. Others stood abandoned but intact, their earth-bermed walls and layered roofs resisting the decay that had claimed conventional cabins built in the same era. Homesteaders moving into remote areas in the 1910s discovered these structures, recognized their unusual soundness, and either restored them or studied them before building their own homes. Forest Service rangers in the 1920s and 30s, surveying remote areas, noted unusual construction in their reports. Cabins built partially underground, heavy stone chimneys, roofs that had supported decades of snow without collapse. The rangers didn't know the history, but they recognized quality engineering when they saw it. Modern building science would eventually formalize the principles Desmond had understood through observation and necessity. Earth berming, passive solar design, thermal mass. These became recognized techniques in energy-efficient construction, taught in architecture schools and promoted by environmental designers. The concepts were presented as innovations of the late 20th century, new solutions to energy costs and environmental concerns. But Desmond had understood them in 1876. He hadn't known the terminology. He couldn't have explained heat transfer coefficients or thermal conductivity values. What he knew was simpler and more direct. Walls don't keep you warm. Walls just slow heat loss. The Earth itself, stable at 45 to 55 degrees year-round below the frost line, provides what walls cannot. Constant temperature, thermal stability, a buffer against extremes. His genius was recognizing that wood fires generate heat, but Earth stores it. Most men built cabins to contain fire's warmth. Desmond built a cabin to harness the ground's steadiness. He turned the Earth into a furnace jacket, surrounding his living space with material that resisted temperature change. He never wrote it down, never patented the design, never promoted himself as an inventor. He solved a problem that had killed his friend, shared the solution with anyone who asked, and moved on with his life. The legacy he left wasn't in books or buildings that bore his name. It was carved in excavated earth and mortared stone scattered across the Rocky Mountains, silent proof that sometimes the best answers come from asking the simplest question: why did my friend have to die?